is really complicating their planning and production process. But if the U.S. can reach a deal with Canada by the end of this week,
at a bad time where domestic demand is kind of slipping as well, and so there's not an outlet for all this whiskey to go.
Well, here at 5, trouble for Kentucky's bourbon industry. Well-known brands in our state are reporting declines in bourbon sales, and distilleries tell us.
But if the U.S. can reach an agreement with Canada by the end of this week, what do they think they can achieve if I told you that one of America's most iconic industries is collapsing because of a single diplomatic insult? In just a few months, a nationwide consumer protest in Canada triggered one of the fastest alcohol boycotts in modern North American history. Shelf-stocking Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and California wines was nearly empty overnight. By the time most Americans realized what was happening, Kentucky distilleries were reporting financial difficulties, downsizing operations, and quietly preparing for bankruptcy. When President Donald Trump proposed Canada becoming the 51st state of the United States, Canadian consumers reacted in a way Washington didn't anticipate. They completely stopped buying American wine. And when a country that accounts for nearly $1 billion in annual revenue suddenly disappears, the economic shock is immediate and devastating. For months, the tariff dispute between Washington and Ottawa had been described by U.S. officials as manageable friction, the kind that great power neighbors absorb as background noise. But the lived reality on the ground looks nothing like a minor diplomatic scuffle. It looks like empty shelves. The first signal came quietly. In early autumn, major provincial retailers in Canada began removing American Spirits bourbon from Kentucky, small batch rye from Pennsylvania, Tennessee craft labels from their prime shelf positions. Within weeks, entire product lines vanished. What looked like a symbolic gesture of defiance turned out to be a calibrated countermeasure, a consumer-facing retaliation designed to strike not at U.S. GDP headlines, but at the household-scale economies of American workers whose livelihoods depend on stable export channels. According to internal figures circulated by the American Craft Spirits Association, the removal of U.S. spirits from Canadian shelves caused immediate double-digit revenue contractions for several mid-sized distilleries. These firms, unlike the multinational conglomerates with diversified markets, operate on thin margins and rely on predictable cross-border demand. One Kentucky distiller reported a 27% production slowdown within 8 weeks, an industrial shock that cascaded through its supply chain, affecting glass bottle suppliers, corn farmers, trucking fleets, and seasonal workers in bottling plants. This is where the tariff battle stops being theoretical. The price of political brinkmanship is paid by families whose Friday paychecks shrink, not because their product is inferior, but because geopolitical signaling has replaced market logic. What Canada executed was not a symbolic protest. It was a direct hit on what trade economists call the industrial hierarchy of U.S.-Canada commerce. Spirits were not chosen at random. They represent a culturally iconic export, highly visible and politically resonant in several swing states. Behind Canada's move lies a deeper transformation, one largely missed by American commentators who still assume the U.S. occupies its traditional position at the center of North America's economic architecture. But Canada's recent retaliation did not aim to shock Washington. It aimed to demonstrate something more consequential, that Ottawa is no longer willing to absorb asymmetric costs to preserve a status quo built in Washington's favor. This shift is not emotional. It is infrastructural. Over the last 3 years, Canada has quietly accelerated a policy doctrine best described as strategic insulation, reducing systemic exposure to U.S. economic cycles while rebuilding its own supply chain sovereignty. The removal of American spirits is simply the most visible consumer-level expression of a much larger reconfiguration. Beneath the retail actions lie long-term investments, federally backed minerals processing zones in Ontario and Quebec, new West Coast port expansions designed to reroute Pacific trade flows through non-U.S. nodes, and a multi-billion-dollar push to anchor EV supply chains entirely within Canadian jurisdiction. What once looked like a defensive posture is evolving into a parallel economic orientation, one that aims to make Canada a central pillar of a transatlantic bloc rather than a subsidiary to U.S. industrial cycles. This is where the symbolic echoes grow louder. American consumers see missing bourbon bottles. Policymakers in Ottawa see something else entirely, a precedent. If a mid-sized export category can be disrupted with such speed, what prevents escalation into sectors Washington has long assumed to be immune medical devices, precision aluminum, aerospace components? Consumers feel the pain first, industries feel it second, nations feel it last, and yet this early stage of the tariff confrontation reveals an uncomfortable truth. Washington is operating under 20th century assumptions about leverage, while Canada is playing a 21st century game rooted in supply chain re-architecture and long horizon capital deployment. What looks like a small commercial dispute is, in reality, the opening chapter of a structural divergence between two economies that once moved in near perfect synchrony. The question is no longer whether Canada can absorb U.S. pressure. The question is whether the U.S. is prepared for a neighbor that is no longer structurally dependent, no longer strategically compliant, and increasingly capable of imposing costs rather than merely enduring them. If a single product category can expose this much vulnerability, what happens when the next phase of Canada's retaliation targets sectors Washington still assumes it controls? The level where governments, not grocery aisles, determine the direction of entire economies. What is unfolding is not merely a trade dispute. It is the deliberate unspooling of a relationship that, for decades, rested on the assumption of predictability, the idea that the U.S. would set the tempo and Canada would synchronize its industrial rhythm accordingly. That assumption is no longer operative. Inside Ottawa, a different conceptual map has taken hold, one that treats North America not as a single integrated production zone, but as a contested landscape where resilience is measured by the ability to detach, reroute, and rebalance. Canadian strategists increasingly describe this moment as a realignment window, a rare period when global volatility creates permission to redraw supply lines, renegotiate dependencies, and reposition the state as a central actor in industrial strategy. The public sees tariffs, insiders see opportunity. In this context, Canada's response to U.S. pressure appears less like a defensive reflex and more like the opening gambit of a long-term project to restructure the industrial hierarchy that has traditionally favored U.S. manufacturing. The sequencing is intentional. First, consumer-level signals, highly visible, calculated to demonstrate that Ottawa will not remain passive. Second, policy moves that alter the foundations of bilateral trade, expedited permitting for critical minerals, incentives for domestic EV battery precursors, and tax architectures designed to pull European and East Asian capital northward rather than south. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Canada is not waiting for U.S. political volatility to subside. It is designing around it. Washington's challenge is that its tariff posture is anchored in 20th century logic. Tariffs as bargaining chips, pressure as negotiation. But Canada is responding with 21st century instruments, industrial planning, multilateral anchoring, and quiet integration into the transatlantic bloc through regulatory harmonization with the EU on green standards, procurement rules, and mineral traceability. This is not retaliation, it is repositioning. Meanwhile, American firms find themselves trapped between two mismatched strategies. U.S. policymakers escalate, Canadian policymakers re-architect. The result is a widening asymmetry of preparation. While Washington improvises, Ottawa invests. And this raises the strategic question that few in the U.S. political class are prepared to entertain. Can the United States continue to treat Canada as a subordinate economic extension when Canada has already begun constructing the infrastructure of independence? If the early stages of the U.S.-Canada tariff confrontation were defined by visible consumer impacts, the next phase operates at a level that rarely reaches public awareness. The architecture of supply chains, the political psychology of alliances, and the slow but decisive migration of industrial power. To understand why Canada's countermeasures carry disproportionate effect, one must examine an overlooked truth. The United States built its economic dominance on the assumption that neighboring economies would remain functionally tethered to its industrial cycles. Canada, for most of the post-war era, accepted this asymmetry publicly as partnership, privately as necessity. But the cumulative shocks of the last decade, Trump-era tariffs, pandemic disruptions, cross-border blockades, and the accelerating unpredictability of U.S. domestic politics have convinced Ottawa that dependency is now a liability, not a guarantee. This insight redefines the battlefield. In trade disputes of the past, retaliation took the form of mirrored tariff lists, symbolic gestures meant to convey displeasure without disturbing the deeper integration beneath. But what Canada is doing now is fundamentally different. It is re-engineering the plumbing of continental commerce. A tariff can be reversed with a signature, a new port, a minerals processing hub, or a reoriented logistics corridor cannot. The strategic term for this is supply chain re-architecture, a long-cycle transformation in which states redesign who produces, who transports, who refines, and who captures the most value in the production stack. Canada has concluded that the era of taking U.S. market access as destiny is over. It is now positioning itself as a northern pillar of the transatlantic bloc, an industrial triangle linking Canadian minerals, European regulatory frameworks, and Asian manufacturing capital seeking geopolitical stability. This shift is already visible in investment flows. German auto giants are directing battery and EV platform development northwards. South Korean cathode producers are embedding themselves in Ontario's new industrial corridors. Even Japanese trading houses, traditionally U.S. aligned, are securing long-term contracts for Canadian cobalt and nickel to hedge against American political oscillation. Each investment is more than capital. It is a vote of confidence in an alternative center of gravity. The United States, meanwhile, faces a strategic paradox. It possesses unmatched scale but diminishing reliability. Its firms depend on predictable inputs, critical minerals, clean electricity, stable trading regimes, yet the political system increasingly trades predictability for performative brinkmanship. Every tariff, every congressional deadlock, every regulatory reversal sends a signal through global supply networks. The U.S. is losing its reputation as an anchor state, and Canada, sensing the vacuum, is stepping in. Ottawa's message to investors is subtle but effective. We cannot be bigger than the United States, but we can be more predictable. Predictability in an era of geopolitical volatility is currency. And Canada spends it well. Long-term regulatory guarantees, multi-decade infrastructure plans, and policy frameworks insulated from electoral whiplash through cross-party consensus on industrial strategy. In contrast, U.S. policy oscillates between two incompatible doctrines: protectionist tariffs that alienate allies, and rhetorical commitments to supply chain resilience that require those same allies to remain cooperative. The contradiction is impossible to sustain. This tension is the hidden danger. Washington still perceives the tariff confrontation as a bilateral dispute, while Ottawa treats it as a structural pivot, an exit lane from the gravitational pull of U.S.-centric industrial hierarchy. For the everyday American consumer, the consequences seem minor: missing bourbon, pricier groceries, slower deliveries. But these are merely the surface indicators of a deeper erosion. The real risks lie in the sectors not yet visible: energy infrastructure, cross-border data governance, aerospace components, biotech precursors. If Canada exercises leverage in these domains, the economic impact will reach orders of magnitude beyond retail discomfort. The emerging question, whispered in think tanks and private boardrooms, is no longer whether Canada can chart its own path. It is whether the United States has misread the moment entirely. If an ally begins quietly constructing the architecture of autonomy, at what point does the old alliance framework become a historical artifact rather than a living arrangement? The third layer of the U.S.-Canada tariff confrontation is the least visible and the most consequential. It is where trade policy dissolves into strategic doctrine and where the structure of entire industries is quietly rewritten. While Washington focuses on the immediate theatrics of tariff reciprocity, Ottawa is quietly rearranging the scaffolding of continental production. This is the part of the conflict that never breaks into headlines, yet it is the part that will define North America's economic architecture for the next 2 decades. The central shift is this: Canada no longer treats supply chains as neutral networks, but as geopolitical corridors, pathways that can concentrate power, redistribute value, or insulate the nation from the volatility of American politics. This is where the traditional U.S. assumption of regional dominance begins to unravel. For decades, American strategists believed that Canada's economic position was fixed, a permanent appendage to U.S. industrial cycles. But Canada's policymakers, especially those operating within the ministries of natural resources, industry, and finance, have been working from a different premise: that the 2022s represent a rare historical window to break path dependency. In practice, this means altering where minerals are refined, where components are assembled, where critical inputs are stored, and where global investors choose to anchor long-term commitments. Canada's aim is not to overtake the United States in scale and impossibility, but to become the predictability hub of the North American production system. The United States offers volume. Canada offers stability. For global manufacturers navigating a world fractured by sanctions, tariff wars, and political oscillation, stability functions as a magnet. The most telling indicator of this shift is the surge of foreign capital into Canadian industrial corridors. German automakers are not simply building factories, they are embedding research centers, IP ownership structures, and multi-decade procurement guarantees into Canadian jurisdiction. South Korean and Japanese conglomerates are not merely sourcing minerals. They are creating vertically integrated chains from mine to cathode, insulated from U.S. regulatory turbulence. Even large American firms, quietly and without fanfare, are redirecting parts of their supply networks northward to hedge against Washington's inconsistency. This migration represents more than opportunistic investment. It signals the formation of an alternative industrial hierarchy, one in which Canada positions itself as the northern anchor of a broader transatlantic bloc, aligned with EU regulatory frameworks and Asian manufacturing discipline. In this emerging map, the United States is no longer the automatic gravitational center. It becomes instead a large, powerful, but increasingly unpredictable partner. And unpredictability is costly. Every tariff announcement in Washington now carries a secondary impact. It injects uncertainty into the cross-border electricity markets, rare earth agreements, aerospace supply lines, and biotech precursor chains that bind the two economies. Canada's response has been elegantly asymmetric. Rather than mirror U.S. tactics, it invests in absorptive infrastructure, new ports on the Pacific to bypass U.S. bottlenecks, expanded rail corridors that link Midwest agriculture to Atlantic shipping routes through Canadian terminals, and mineral processing facilities designed specifically to circumvent U.S. choke points. These choices recalibrate dependence. The more Ottawa builds, the more Washington loses leverage. And for the first time in modern memory, U.S. policymakers are encountering a strategic dilemma they are unprepared for: how to negotiate with a neighbor that is no longer structurally dependent, no longer politically deferential, and increasingly capable of converting its resource base into geopolitical bargaining power. Meanwhile, the American public sees none of this. They see higher prices, longer delivery times, and fewer product options, surface-level symptoms of a deeper realignment that is shifting the industrial map beneath their feet. What is unfolding is not simply a tariff clash, it is the reconfiguration of continental advantage. Canada is no longer playing defense. It is constructing a future, which leads to the quiet questions circulating in private briefings on both sides of the border. If Canada continues re-architecting the supply chains that once defined U.S. dominance, will Washington recognize the shift in time, or only after the industrial balance has already tilted northward? If the economic dimension explains how Canada is reshaping the North American order, the political dimension explains why. Tariffs may be the spark, but the deeper forces driving Ottawa's transformation lie in a subtle shift in political psychology, one shaped by a decade of observing U.S. volatility from uncomfortably close range. For Canadian policymakers, the lesson of the past 10 years is brutally simple. The United States is no longer a predictable hegemon. Trade deals rewritten. Alliances questioned. Domestic gridlock exported as global risk. From NAFTA's renegotiation to pandemic border disruptions, the political reality is clear. Washington does not guarantee stability, it generates uncertainty. And uncertainty, in the age of strategic competition, is a national security threat. Ottawa's response is not emotional, it is systemic. The logic now guiding Canadian strategy can be summarized in 3 principles. 1. Reduce strategic exposure to U.S. political swings. If American policy can change every 4 years, Canada's dependence must shrink every 1. 2. Re-anchor national security in economic sovereignty. Critical minerals, ports, and energy grids are treated not as commercial assets, but as geopolitical shields. 3. Embed Canada into multilateral structures where U.S. dominance is diluted. Regulatory harmonization with the EU, long-term supply agreements with South Korea and Japan, and participation in Indo-Pacific frameworks all serve one purpose: diversification. The result is a quiet but profound inversion of North America's traditional hierarchy. For decades, Ottawa adapted to Washington's political climate. Today, it prepares for the possibility that Washington's climate is no longer governable. What makes this moment especially consequential is the broader geopolitical context. The world is reorganizing itself into blocks, not ideological blocks, but supply chain blocks, energy blocks, semiconductor blocks. In each, predictability is the currency that attracts global investment. And this is the arena where Canada sees its opening, not to outweigh the United States, but to outstabilize it. This explains why Canada's retaliation to U.S. tariffs appears so calibrated. From removing American spirits on retail shelves to shifting procurement rules and reshaping export licenses, every move is designed to send a controlled signal: Canada will no longer be the passive side of the equation. Washington, however, interprets these signals through an outdated lens, assuming that Canadian toughness is temporary or symbolic or ultimately constrained by proximity. Yet the internal memos circulating in Ottawa suggest a longer horizon. They describe the tariff conflict as an inflection point, a chance to prove to markets, investors, and allies that Canada is not merely reacting to American pressure, but stepping into a new strategic identity. This is the part most analysts miss. Canada's assertiveness is not aimed at the United States, it is aimed at the world. Ottawa wants investors, allies, and strategic partners to see that when geopolitical stress rises, Canada adapts without fracturing. If that narrative solidifies, the consequences extend far beyond trade policy. They will shape where capital flows, where semiconductor fabs are built, where energy grids are integrated, and ultimately where influence pools in the decades ahead. Which sets up the question at the heart of this analysis. If the U.S. keeps escalating tariffs under the assumption that Canada will absorb the shock, what happens when Canada becomes the more stable and therefore more attractive center of North American economic gravity? By now, the tariff dispute resembles less a policy disagreement and more a cartographic correction, a redrawing of the mental map through which North Americans have long interpreted power. What began with bourbon being pulled from Canadian shelves has evolved into a multi-layered reconfiguration of economic alignment, strategic posture, and political identity. The real story is not the tariffs themselves, but what they have revealed: that the old assumptions underpinning U.S.-Canada relations are eroding faster than Washington can adapt. Canada's emergence as a more predictable node in the global system should not be mistaken for a bid for primacy. It is a bid for insulation. Ottawa is constructing a national architecture designed to withstand the turbulence of a world where traditional hegemons wobble and new blocks form with startling speed. The transatlantic corridor stretching from Canadian mineral basins to European regulatory engines has already begun to operate like an alternative scaffolding for industrial planning. Asian capital, seeking geopolitical stability rather than ideological alignment, is flowing accordingly. Meanwhile, the United States finds itself caught between two realities. Its material power remains enormous, yet its political system increasingly transmits volatility outward like an electrical surge. Global investors feel it, supply chain planners feel it, even American mid-sized manufacturers, those who suffered first from Canada's shelf removals, feel it with uncomfortable clarity. The deeper danger is not that the U.S. is losing power, but that it is losing the confidence of partners who once relied on it as the continental stabilizer. Against this backdrop, the U.S.-Canada tariff confrontation becomes a symbolic rerun of a larger phenomenon. The moment when a great power assumes its leverage is permanent, while its quieter neighbor rewrites the rules of interdependence. The United States still acts as if Canada's structural deference is guaranteed. Yet Canada today behaves like a country preparing for a future where the U.S. may be an ally important, yes, but not the gravitational center of its strategic world. This is why the most consequential changes are occurring in places the general public does not see. In procurement ministries drafting decade-long energy frameworks, in interministerial councils designing autonomous mineral supply lines, in European capitals quietly aligning environmental and industrial regulations with Canada rather than the U.S. Each change is small in isolation. Together, they represent a pivot away from assumed hierarchy and toward constructed resilience. The irony is striking. The tariff war that Washington believed would pressure Canada into accommodation has instead accelerated Canada's departure from the old industrial orbit, where the U.S. expected compliance, it triggered innovation. Where it expected silence, it triggered strategy. The metaphorical Bourbon shelves were never the end. They were the opening signal that the asymmetry of dependence is no longer a structural fact. And so the North American landscape enters a new phase one, in which the question is no longer who is stronger, but who is more structurally prepared for the emerging world. The nation that still assumes loyalty, or the nation that quietly rebuilds its sovereignty behind the scenes. Which leads us to the final unresolved question, the one policymakers on both sides acknowledge in private but avoid in public. If Canada continues constructing an economic future that does not require American stability, how long before investors, allies, and even U.S. companies follow the same logic?